part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. I'm your host, Ben Billman, and I'm excited to bring you a mid-summer episode of what is going on in college basketball at this point. The main part of this episode will be the look at the 10 most intriguing teams at this point in the summer heading into the 24-25 season. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be the best teams, but there's just a lot of intrigue, a lot of excitement, and a lot of changes that have taken place in those programs over the last couple of months since the end of the season when Connecticut cut down the nets for the national championship. Before we get into that, though, I just have to talk a little bit about the passing of one of the all-time greats in college basketball, Bill Walton. Now, many of you might hear the name Bill Walton and think of the Grateful Dead, his following of them, kind of the hippie nature that he lived by, and more than likely you see him as a commentator and an analyst, which was what he was for the last 25, 30 years of his career in basketball. One of the things that I always enjoyed was the Maui Invitational every year at the beginning of the season in college basketball. That tournament always occurs right around Thanksgiving, so I had a chance to sit down and watch those games. And growing up, Bill was one of the main commentators for those games. He brought an awkward feel to the game. It always felt like the person that he was commentating with felt a little bit out of place, and he brought a goofiness to the game, which at points it felt like he went over the top, but then you look back and think, well, maybe that really was the real Bill Walton, and I think it was. But what many people don't realize is that he played at UCLA under John Wooden. He won 2 national titles there at UCLA, and then he went on to the NBA. He won a title with the Portland Trail Blazers and then won near the end of his career with maybe the best team in NBA history, the 1986 Boston Celtics. So had an amazing career, followed up by an amazing announcer career. One of the greats of all time, and one of the things I really appreciate about Bill Walton, even though him and John Wooden were two polar opposites in the way they lived, what they believed, and how they lived, and what they thought about the game of basketball, Bill Walton never had a bad word to say about John Wooden, praised John Wooden as a man and as a coach. And I really appreciated that about Bill and the way he revered not only John Wooden, but the UCLA basketball program and all the alumni and all the players that have come through that program through the years. So a big loss losing Bill Walton, and condolences to his family, the UCLA basketball program, and all those that played with him and knew him in both commentating and in basketball. And that made me wonder, when I was looking back at the history of college basketball, where Bill Walton would rank all time in the best college basketball players in history. And I've got to think he's a top 5 player when it comes to his size, his strength, his ability to pass, probably the best passing big man of all time in both college and professional basketball. If I had to rank the top 5 college basketball players of all time, I think Lou Alcindor, or better known when he got to the NBA, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, would have to be number 1. One of the best big men of all time, won 3 national titles at UCLA, probably would have won 4, but back in that era, freshmen were not allowed to play on the varsity team. At number 2, I would put Pete Maravich, the all-time leading scorer in men's basketball. Now, in the past year, we saw Caitlin Clark break the all-time scoring title, but in men's basketball, it is still held by Pete Maravich. He averaged 44 points per game, and back in this era as well, there was no three-point line, which means he probably would have averaged 50 or more, depending on where he was shooting from and if those shots, instead of 2, counted for 3. And then to finish out the list, I would put Bill Russell, who won 2 titles at San Francisco, and then Bill Walton, again winning 2 titles at UCLA. That would be my Mount Rushmore of college basketball players all time. First off the list, I would put Oscar Robertson, who also won 2 titles at Cincinnati, and in his career at Cincinnati averaged 34 points, 15 rebounds a game, and obviously in the NBA was a triple-double machine. So that would be my list of the top 5 college basketball players of all time, and Bill Walton is definitely there, and that is a big loss for college basketball overall. Okay, so I just wanted to touch on that before I got started, and I'm sure going into this next season, there will be tributes for Bill, especially with the Pac-12, who he was a big proponent of, basically dissolving and those schools joining different conferences, and now UCLA making the jump to the Big Ten. It would have been fascinating to see his reaction to all of that, but unfortunately we won't get to hear that in the upcoming season. But again, watching UCLA in the Big Ten is going to be a big change, and something I think he would have had a major voice as far as how that goes. Okay, so moving on to the main topic of this podcast. At this point in the off season, most of the transfers have moved on to new schools, signed with new schools. Any players that were entered in the NBA draft have now either kept their names in the draft or they have exited the draft and returned to their schools that they played with. So we have a pretty good idea at this point of the roster makeup of most of these teams. The coaching carousel, at least at this point, is over. There is always the chance that a college coach could jump to the NBA in the offseason, but at this point, I don't see that happening. So the coaching carousel is over, and now it's just a time to wait and see where we are in college basketball. But there are 10 teams that I have my eye on that I think are super intriguing and are going to be big in the storyline of the 24-25 college basketball season. Now, again, this does not necessarily mean that these are the 10 best teams. This doesn't necessarily mean that I think these teams have any aspirations of Final Four hopes. Most of them do. But overall, these are just the teams that had major changes, major adjustments, or are entering a new era of their program if they are moving conferences. Okay, so these are in no particular order. These are just 10 teams that I think we're going to keep an eye on in the 24-25 season. And the first one will be the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. Now, Rutgers did not have the best season last year. They did not make it to the NCAA tournament. And to be honest, I think it was a little bit of a disappointment during the 23-24 year. But one thing that they have coming in to this next year are the number 2 and number 3 players in the 2024 class that are entering as freshmen this fall. Ace Bailey and Dylan Harper are the 2 and 3 players respectively in the incoming freshman rankings, and I think immediately you have to look at that and say, okay, I think at this point we've seen the one and done era for the most part being over, with the champions year after year for the last decade or so being teams that are high in veteran play and players that have been there a lot. But can Rutgers overcome that, the delay and the inability of teams to win with freshmen. Having two players of that caliber is going to be highly interesting in a Big Ten conference that I think is fairly wide open. We did have Zach Edey. He is now gone from Purdue, the two-time National Player of the Year in a Purdue team that lost in the national championship game. This is a conference where I think Rutgers has a good chance to make a run in that conference, maybe not win the conference, but be right there at the end of the season when it comes to that. So that would be team number 1 on the most intriguing teams going into this upcoming season. Again, these are in no particular order, but the next team I have would be Ole Miss. Now, Chris Beard did a very good job in year number 1 as the head coach at Ole Miss. Again, they did not make it to the NCAA tournament, but they did have some very impressive wins with a roster that was put together basically at the last moment. Chris Beard is known, he was known at Texas Tech and Texas, as a coach who can bring in transfers and win right away. And he is doing that again at Ole Miss. He is bringing in 3 transfers from Virginia Tech, Seton Hall, and Belmont. From Virginia Tech, Sean Padula. From Seton Hall, Dre Davis. And from Belmont, Malik Dia. And the most impactful move of the summer is that Matthew Morrell, their best player from last year, who tested the waters in the NBA draft, is now returning to Ole Miss, and he will be the centerpiece of a team that I think will challenge for an SEC championship. Chris Beard has tournament experience with Texas Tech. He had a great tenure at Texas before moving on from there, and I think that team is going to improve in year 2 under Chris Beard. It wouldn't surprise me if they are a dark horse for the Final Four and a team that is going to finish in the top half, if not the top quarter, in the SEC. So that is team number 2 when it comes to the most intriguing teams at the midpoint of the summer. Okay, team number 3, and I just mentioned this team when talking about Bill Walton, and it is the UCLA Bruins. UCLA, again, the Pac-12 is dissolving. It has dissolved. All conference events are now over. Now that the Pac-12 baseball and softball seasons are over, the Pac-12 is officially dead. We don't have any more official events in the Pac-12, and who knows what the future holds, if we will ever see a re-emergence or any sort of revitalization of that conference. There's no telling, but at this point it doesn't look like that's the case. But UCLA is moving to the Big Ten. Mick Cronin, the head coach who made the Final Four in 2021 with the Bruins, the last few seasons have been a little disappointing since then. But moving to the Big Ten, this is a chance to create a new identity for this program and for this team. He does return a lot of talent from last year, and he also adds 2 of the biggest transfers from the offseason in Kobe Johnson, a transfer from USC, and Tyler Bilodeau, a big-time scorer from Oregon State. They can revitalize this program, and they can make a splash in the Big Ten. The question is, and this has been a question on my mind for quite a while, UCLA, in some cases, is 3 time zones away from many of their opponents who will be in the Big Ten. Now, this could work in their favor, or it could be a detriment to them. For teams traveling to UCLA, this could be a detriment when it comes to jet lag and travel. But then you look on the opposite side, will it affect UCLA when half of their games, or almost half of their games, are in the Big Ten? Road games are going to be large travel, long hours in an airplane, and not much time to prepare or get ready for the change in time zones. So UCLA is a very intriguing team. Of the 4 teams joining the Big Ten, I would put them as one of the 2 contenders that I think can make a big splash early on. The other team will be Oregon, and I'll talk a little bit more about them here in just a couple of minutes. So that UCLA is the third team that is highly intriguing going into the 24-25 college basketball season. Okay, being from Indiana and being a Hoosier by birth and a Hoosier by fandom growing up, the fourth team that I have to look at here is the Indiana Hoosiers. Now, these last few years under Mike Woodson have been highly disappointing. In 2023, having two incredible players, including Trace Jackson Davis, who has gone on and had a really good year with the Golden State Warriors this past year. You would think they would have done more with the talent that they've had, but unfortunately, they only won one game in the NCAA tournament in Trace's senior year, and then this past year was a complete disaster with many losses in the Big Ten, and unfortunately, no bid to the NCAA tournament, which for Hoosiers fans is just blasphemous at this point. And it looked like Indiana was headed for another miserable season upcoming in 24-25. But Indiana has made what is probably the biggest push and has the best transfer portal signings, the number one class of transfers in college basketball. That includes Miles Rice, a big-time scorer from Washington State, Kanan Carlisle, a big-time scorer from Stanford, and Omar Ballo, a big man from Arizona, who will be the starting center immediately for this Hoosier team. Along with that, they also had the returns of Mackenzie Mbako and Malik Renew. Trey Galloway is also returning, and then Luke Goody from Illinois, who probably won't start, but one of the main things Indiana needed last year was shooting, and he will provide that probably off the bench during the season for Indiana. So any questions about Mike Woodson, his ability to coach or recruit, at least for right now, they have been answered. Now the big question for Indiana is, with all these different pieces, with the number one transfer class in the United States, will he be able to put it all together and use all this talent to compete for a Big Ten championship? And that is the question that will need to be answered. I think we will see right away early in the season whether or not that is the case. Okay. Finally, before we take a timeout for a couple commercials, the fifth team on my list of the most intriguing teams at this point during the summer would have to be the Arkansas Razorbacks. If you would have told me during the Final Four that by June, Coach Calipari would be the head coach at Arkansas and that he would be bringing along a lot of talent with him, I don't think I would have believed you. It has been an incredible change for Calipari. I think it will be a good change for him, and I think Arkansas has the ability to support that team, and they're going to be very exciting heading into next year. Now, the question is, Arkansas basically lost everybody from last year. I don't believe anyone of consequence returned to this roster. So John Calipari has had to go out, get some players from the portal, get some players that were recruits to Kentucky to decommit from Kentucky and commit to Arkansas, and he has been very successful so far. Two of the main players, including DJ Wagner, are coming over from Kentucky. He's also bringing in really solid players that will be key starters. John L. Davis from Florida Atlantic, and then also Jonas Adu, a big-time player from Tennessee, will be the starting center, as well as Zvonimir Ivasic, a big man from Kentucky as well. A question with them, just like with Indiana, is will John Calipari be able to put all these new pieces and pieces that have never played for the Razorbacks together in just the few short months that he has before the start of the 24-25 season? He's been successful so far in his career, bringing in new guys and being successful, but he struggled in recent years at Kentucky to have tournament success. Will that follow him to Arkansas, or will he be able to flip the switch and get Arkansas at the high level and competing for Final Fours and national championships? All right, we're going to take a break here. When I come back, 5 more teams that will be the most intriguing at this point in the summer and heading into the 24-25 season.
Hi, everybody. It's John Tellage from the Guardians of the Land MLB podcast. Be sure to hop on with us to follow all the dramatic developments of the reigning American League Central Division champions. From game analysis to interviews to keeping tabs on who could be the next breakout star. We'll have that and much, much more right here. It's the Guardians of the Land MLB podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. Subscribe here and join the fun.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Amico from Cavs on the Break NBA podcast. Be sure to give us a listen for all your Cleveland Cavaliers recaps, analysis, breakdowns, draft talk, free agency. The list goes on and on. Give us a listen, Cavs on the Break NBA podcast.
Welcome back to the second half of the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. So in the first half, I gave a quick tribute to Bill Walton and the greatness that he brought to the game of college basketball, along with the top or 5 of the most interesting teams heading in to the college basketball season, with the intrigue and the possible success that they bring to the table. But again, this list does not necessarily mean I think these teams will be successful, but they are intriguing, and they're going to be major storylines heading into November and the beginning of the college basketball season. So in the second half, I want to look at 5 more teams that I believe at this point are very intriguing, and I will be watching closely as we move toward the season. So team number 6 would be the Purdue Boilermakers. Now, Purdue is coming off one of the best seasons, if not the best season in program history, making it all the way to a national championship game. Zach Edey, 2-time National Player of the Year. But Zach Edey is now gone, and that means that Purdue has to find a whole new way to play the game of basketball. For the last few years, Zach Edey has been the focal point of that offense and defense. He has been their go-to guy. He has been the stalwart around the rim. He has been the absolute most dominating player in college basketball for the last 2 years. So now that he is gone, what does Matt Painter do to rebuild this program and to get them and maintain the level that they've been at for the last couple of years? Well, the good thing for Purdue is that they are returning a lot of talent and probably have the best guards in the country in Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer returning for that team. And there is going to be a lot of pressure on those 2 guys to be successful this season for the Boilermakers. But not only that, they do return other players such as Trey Kaufman-Wren and Camden Heide, who will be more than likely starters on that team. They have a solid recruiting class coming in, probably nobody that's going to just dominate from day one, but they will add good depth and should add some firepower to that bench for the Boilermakers. But as we saw this past season, when Zach Edey was on the bench or he wasn't playing well, this team was an absolute disaster. Outside of Zach Edey in the national championship game, this team just had no answers for Connecticut. And I know that Connecticut is the 2-time defending national champions. They've played at a high level, and they'll have multiple draft picks this year in the NBA draft. But without Zach Edey, this team really struggled defensively, really struggled to score, really struggled to shoot the basketball. And now that he's gone, who is going to be the scoring threat and the go-to guy offensively? I've got to think it's Braden Smith. He's the guy that was that second target last year behind Zach Edey. Can he become the number one option and continue the success under Matt Painter that they've had over the past few years? I still expect Purdue to be near or at the top of the Big Ten, but with the new teams coming in, I think it's going to be difficult to see them as a dominating team like they've been and they were last year. Okay, the next team on my list is the Connecticut Huskies, number 7 on my list of the most intriguing teams in college basketball. As I just mentioned, back-to-back national champions. And the question now rises. They're losing a lot of talent to the NBA, but can Dan Hurley get this team back to win 3 championships in a row, which would be just unbelievable if they could pull that off. And I'm intrigued to see if he can do it. Now, again, losing a lot to the NBA, but just recently, Alex Caravan, one of the main players and starters for last year's team, decided to withdraw from the NBA draft. So he will be back, along with other players that played key roles, Hassan Diarra and Samson Johnson. Along with those additions or those returners, they have added Aiden Mahaney, one of the best point guards in the country, coming over from St. Mary's, and then Liam McNeely, a player who was originally committed to go to Indiana, decided to transfer, and now is going to Connecticut and could be the next star big man for that team. Now, it's going to be near impossible. I don't want to say that they have a chance to win the national championship because I think it would be very, very difficult for them. But Dan Hurley has reloaded, and he has this team looking like a team that is going to be at the top of the Big East again and could potentially compete for a national championship, which is just incredible when you think about all they've been through and what they've accomplished over the last few years. So that team is number 7 on my list in no particular order of the most intriguing teams heading into the 24-25 season. Number 8 on my list will be the Oregon Ducks. Now, as I mentioned with UCLA, Oregon is now transferring or relocating to the Big Ten. Oregon is coming off a good season last year. Dana Altman continues to build a program there that is competitive year in and year out, and they get better as the season goes on, and we've seen that multiple times with the Ducks in the past few years, where they are tournament ready in March and ready to play and do very, very well, even if they are a lower seeded team. So, the thing that Oregon has done very well, they have one of the best transfer classes in the country, something that I think Dana Altman will be able to produce a lot of success from. And along with UCLA, I look at Oregon as a team that could be successful right off the bat in the Big Ten. Dana Altman does have Midwest roots, so he knows that style of basketball. He coached at Creighton for a long time, and I think that will help as he builds this program. But the one thing I am interested in, as with UCLA, is just the time difference and the travel that they're going to have going into this season. Some of the players they're bringing in through the transfer portal include TJ Bamba from Villanova, one of the best shooting guards in the country, and someone that I believe will have a major impact from day one. And then Brandon Angel, a transfer from Stanford, who is also going to be a big-time player for them heading into this upcoming season. They do have a lot of experience returning. I don't know if they can compete for a Big Ten championship from day one, but I think they are going to shock a lot of people, and I think they will be a tournament team and one that Dana Altman has to feel pretty good about heading into the Big Ten. Okay, 2 more teams that I have on my list, and I think both of these teams are national title contenders heading into this upcoming season. The first of these 2 would be the Alabama Crimson Tide. So Nate Oates made the Final Four last year after having an incredible season the year before with Brandon Miller in the 22-23 season, where they were the number 1 overall seed and made it to the Sweet 16. This past year, Mark Sears, the point guard, led them all the way to the Final Four, and a battle between them and Connecticut, where Connecticut was just the better team. And it looked like Alabama might be headed for a drop-off after their Final Four run because of the questions around Mark Sears and also Jaron Stevenson and if they would return to the program or not. Both of those players decided to return, and I believe heading into next season, Mark Sears will be the preseason National Player of the Year. He has the talent. He shoots the ball well. He passes well. It's always nice to have an extension of the head coach on the floor, and I think Mark Sears is probably the definition of that heading into next year. He knows what Nate Oates wants. This is his 3rd year under Nate Oates, and he is a difference maker in college basketball. He averaged close to 22 points per game last season, and he is going to lead that team to great heights, and it wouldn't surprise me to see that team back in the Final Four. But as with a lot of other teams, they've added some major transfers. Aiden Holloway from Auburn, Chris Youngblood from South Florida, and Cliff Omoruyi from Rutgers. And the question is, can Nate Oates do what he's done in the past and blend these transfers in with who I think is the best player heading into next year in college basketball? That is going to be very intriguing, and the Alabama Crimson Tide at this point are my favorite to win the national championship, to win the SEC, and be the team at the top of the standings in March of 2025. So they would be my early favorite at this point to win the championship. And then finally on my list, the last team that I am going to keep an eye on heading in to 24-25 that is really intriguing is the Kansas Jayhawks. Now, right now, a lot of lists online have Kansas as the preseason number 1 team in the country. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think they're going to be a great team, but I also saw a lot of flaws in that program in this past season, and I still have a lot of questions about what they're going to do heading into this upcoming season. But one thing that I can't question is the talent that this program has heading into next year. Probably the biggest piece of the puzzle was the return of Hunter Dickinson, one of the best big men in the country, someone who dominated at Michigan, transferred to Kansas last year and had another amazing season at Kansas. But the intriguing part that I need to watch is, can he be a leader when it comes to victories and winning in college basketball? Yes, he put up big-time stats last year in college basketball, but that didn't necessarily lead to wins for the Kansas Jayhawks. Now, one of the things they struggled with last year, a lot of injuries to that roster, and that really hindered them when it came to the NCAA tournament. But they do return KJ Adams and DeJuan Harris, both solid contributors from last year, and brought in one of the highest-ranked transfers in AJ Storr from Wisconsin. AJ is a big-time scorer who averaged around 17 points at Wisconsin, and I think he is going to push Kansas into the discussion for a Big 12 title and also in the discussion for a Final Four and a national championship run. Kansas is definitely in my top 3 teams for next year, but they really need to figure out, and Hunter Dickinson needs to figure out how to be a leader who both scores and capitalizes on this scoring to turn it into victories come March. So those are the 10 teams that I am most intrigued about heading in to next season. A couple storylines that I'm also intrigued about to finish out this podcast. First of all, as conference realignment takes place, how does this affect the conferences overall? We now have 5 major conferences in college basketball with the Pac-12 disappearing. How does this change the landscape of college basketball now that the West Coast has their teams spread across the country in other conferences? This is going to be a landmark season for college basketball. The Big 12 is going to be wild with the addition of many teams, the Big 10, and then the ACC adding a handful of teams as well, and Texas and Oklahoma heading to the SEC. There are a lot of questions around that, and can these new teams jump into these new conferences and be successful right away? One of the other intriguing storylines is going to be how new coaches coach in new atmospheres. Obviously, the big name through all of this is Coach Calipari at Arkansas, but we've also seen other coaches at other places who are going to make a splash, including Musselman at USC. What is he going to do? And then Mark Pope at Kentucky. Again, Kentucky, most players decided to go pro or transfer, so he's had to try to reinstate the magic at Kentucky and be successful there. So the coaching carousel and how those coaches will do in their first years at their new programs. And then I think the biggest story of the season will be Connecticut. Do they have a chance to three-peat? Can they do what no team has done since John Wooden and UCLA back in the 60s and 70s, winning 3 championships in a row? Can Dan Hurley do that with a rebuilt team centered around Alex Caravan and Liam McNeely, the freshmen, and what can they do there? All right, well, I thank you so much for joining in to pay tribute a little bit to Bill Walton and the greatness that he was as a player and a commentator. Looking at the 10 most intriguing teams at this point in the offseason, and then a couple of the storylines to keep an eye on as we get closer to the start of the season coming up here in just a couple months. I will see you all in just a couple weeks to discuss a few more topics and see if anything has changed in the world of college basketball. But I really thank you for tuning in, and I will hope to see you all soon. Thank you for listening to the Press Play Podcast Network. To follow us on X, look up Press Play Pods. For sponsorship plans and more information, please email admin@pressplaypodcast.com. And to listen to all our shows and learn more about our network, please visit www.pressplaypodcasts.com.